Reparation. The action of making amends for a wrong one has done by providing payment or other assistance to those who have been wronged. That is the definition of the word under which I shall be arguing tonight, ladies and gentlemen. But first, I would like to ask something of you. Reparations for many people, like the first speaker on the opposition, carry connotations of money grabbing or financial handouts, but this motion is about more than that. Thus, I'd like you to think of it like this, as this House believes that Britain must make amends to her former colonies, which clarifies the much wider scope of this motion. Now, the British Empire at its height was the largest in history, ruling over about 1/5 of the world's population at the time, and covering almost a quarter of the Earth's total land area. Given its vast breadth, the experiences of British colonialism in Africa versus India versus the Caribbean versus elsewhere in the world are greatly different. And so, for the purpose of providing some specificity, I intend to focus mainly on the African experience, being of Ugandan descent myself, and leave it to my esteemed colleagues on the proposition to make the cases for those other territories. Before I move on to why Britain actively owes reparations to her former colonies, I shall first, in anticipation, respond to those who would say that Britain does not and should not owe reparations at all. I was made aware of a conversation about this motion by a friend of mine a short while ago, in which the following comment was made. Well, I suppose then that we should take back the roads, the education, and the language as well at the same time. This sort of argument, this so-called white man's burden to travel the ends of the world, enlightening and Christianizing simple natives who would otherwise have nothing, is, if I may be frank, insulting and quite naive. Africa was the home of ancient kingdoms long before the arrival of colonialists, with our own cultures, our own cities, our own religions, and indeed our very own languages. Where complex civilizations were encountered, they were denied. John Hanning Speke, upon discovering the Kingdom of Buganda and its highly developed society and constitutional monarchy, expounded the theory that these people must be descended from a small residue of the original European stock. Even as late as the 1960s and 70s, the white minority government of Rhodesia denied that the ruined remains of a huge ancient stone city in what is now Zimbabwe had been built by black Africans and pressured archaeologists into doing the same. The scramble for Africa, by its own wording alone, shows what little respect these colonialists had for the people within these lands which they were rapaciously partitioning amongst themselves. So do not let yourselves be deceived into believing that British colonialism, despite the small amount of good which it brought about in the form of modernization, was an altruistic endeavor of civilizing savages, when that was simply a ruse for European powers to take more land, amass greater wealth, and gain higher prestige in internal power struggles over global dominance. King Leopold II of Belgium put it well when he said that he didn't want to miss a chance of grabbing a slice of this fine African cake for himself. His intentions were also declared as humanitarian and philanthropic, although this somehow translated into forcing all the natives into rubber latex extraction, chopping off their hands if they did not meet the impossible quotas, causing the deaths of 10 million people, around 20 to 50% of the population at the time, and using the revenue from the rubber sales to erect in Belgium many beautiful arches, parks, and buildings, including, ironically, the Royal Museum for Central Africa. But this motion is about Britain and not Belgium, so let me not digress. The other defense often used against calls for reparations is that this was all done in the past, and that one should not blame the descendants of colonialists for their ancestors' crimes, and that we should all move on. This is somewhat of a fair point. As the adage goes, the son should not inherit the sins of the father, or indeed the daughter of the mother. But that is not what the demand for reparations implies. I won't mention the wealth inherited by people like Benedict Cumberbatch and David Cameron from the slave trade, including the hundreds of millions of pounds paid out as compensation to slave-owning families by the British government, as that is a separate issue. The call for reparations recognises that all the advantages and disadvantages gained by the coloniser and the colonised continue to trickle down the generations, leaving a huge inequality that is rooted in the past. How much wealth exactly do you think Britain received from the oil, the minerals, ivory, precious metals and stones, etc., which it, let's be frank, stole from other people, and the human capital which it exploited in India, in Africa, and all over the world? Rome was not built in a day, and neither was Britain, nor any other colonial power whose infrastructure, cities, and beautiful buildings were financed with the proceeds of colonial rule from resources which were forcibly claimed as their own. Thus, to present the current states of former colonies and colonial powers and the people therein as totally disconnected from their shared past is a gross misrepresentation of the historical reality. Indeed, the son shall not inherit the sins of the father, but it is a shame that these sins cannot be used as financial capital as well. Otherwise, I'm sure that the son would be clamouring for such a bequest. But let's not ignore the cultural damage colonialism wrought on the world. The destruction and theft of one's patrimony has an extremely pernicious effect on a people's psyche, denying their heritage and upholding this narrative that there was no culture and no art and nothing of worth before the colonialists. After failing to trick the ruler of Benin, of the Empire of Benin, into allowing its annexation, and despite warnings that no foreigners could enter the city during religious rituals, the British government sent a small contingent of men in anyway. What happened? They were killed. 9 British soldiers were killed. In response, Britain led a punitive expedition that's literally razed the Benin Empire to the ground, killed thousands, and utterly eradicated centuries of history, and looted innumerable precious ancient artifacts that were then sold all over the world. Since we are talking about making amends, how about Britain respond to modern-day Nigeria's demands for these Benin bronzes' repatriation? Shockingly enough, the British Museum actually sold some of these objects back to Nigeria in the 50s and 70s. Now, imagine the burglar who destroyed your house telling you that in order for you to get your stuff back, you have to buy it off him. It's hard to believe. No, thank you. How many more artifacts in the British Museum and others across the globe were pillaged from their countries of origin? I suppose the concept of money given for things taken only works one way. However, to be fair, in 2013, the British government paid out £20 million in compensation to 5,228 survivors of the Mau Mau rebellion against colonial rule in Kenya from 1952 to 1960, amounting to around £3,000 each. The following are the words of one participant in an interrogation at a British detention camp in Kenya at the time. Things got a little out of hand. By the time I cut his balls off, he had no ears, and his eyeball, the right one I think, was hanging out of its socket. Too bad he died before we got much out of him. Some others were flogged to death. Others were roasted alive, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 11,000 to 100,000. Now, I think that this demonstrates the extent of colonial oppression, and I say that this isolated incident of the British government admitting wrongdoing is quite honestly not enough. Nevertheless, I am not about to stand here and advocate for the bankrupting of the Bank of England. Some figures estimate the cost of reparations being in the trillions. Now, not only is that unfeasible, but it would also be extremely difficult to implement. Why? Well, because firstly, I believe it would take a revolution in power structures that I just cannot see ever happening, but there are also other issues at hand. To whom would the money be paid out and how? How would we avoid corrupt politicians embezzling this money? These points are all valid. However, as I have stated before, this motion is not about how much reparations should be or how they should be given. Truthfully, this motion for me is not really even about the money at all, because I do not believe that one can put a price on human suffering. I do not believe that any amount of money can atone for the damage done to people's cultures, their histories, mentalities, and their dignity. But when people like Gordon Brown in 2005 can say that Britain must stop apologizing for its colonial history and be proud of the great British values of tolerance, liberty, and civic duty which the empire spread across the globe, then I think there's clearly much more to be said and done. To close, I reiterate that the demand for reparations is not about money-grabbing despots seeking to line their pockets, or embittered people of colour blaming any one of the British people in this room right now for things that happened decades ago. This is about accepting the legacy of harm and division that colonialism and divide and rule brought. This is about not perpetuating white guilt, but recognising black and brown suffering. This is about admitting the privilege which history brought on one group of people via the dehumanization, exploitation, and oppression of others, and denouncing it. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you side with the opposition tonight, you shall not be sparing Britain an eternity of inherited debt and shame, but saying that you do not believe that Britain needs to make any amends for the colonial era, that you do not think that imperialism was a bad thing, and that racism, Eurocentrism, economic inequality, the whitewashing of history, and a simple lack of respect for non-white people and their historical abuse is fine, and that is why I urge the House to propose the motion.